Welcome everyone to this webinar from wherever you are speaking, listening, and observing. My name is Ehrt. I'm the Director of Programs of ILGA World, and I will be moderating this webinar. We have a wonderful list of speakers in this webinar with the title Serving LGBTI Communities in COVID-19 Times, Impact and Response to the Pandemic Among LGBTI Organizations. Before Victor Madrigal-Borloz, the independent expert on SOGI, and Ymania Brown, the Co-Secretary General of ILGA World, are going to kick us off. I'll have a couple of quick announcements to make around housekeeping and about the flow of the event. Maybe first, I have two colleagues here on the webinar who are helping me to moderate and deal with the back end of this whole thing. There's Daniele Paletta, the communications officer of ILGA, the senior communications officer of ILGA World, and Maddalena Tomasini, our communications intern. They'll help me managing the Q&A section and the chat. And everyone who's ever hosted a webinar knows that there's like plenty to do, like too much to do for one person, I think. So I'm very glad to have them on the call. We are recording this webinar, and the webinar will be available on ILGA World's YouTube channel afterwards. So that's particularly important for the people who will be intervening in the Q&A section. So if you have security concerns, you might not want to show your video, or you might want to change the way how your name appears. If you realize that only afterwards, please send us an email or a communication that we can as well alter that before this goes online. I've just mentioned it as well before there, although this is a roundtable and we do want to manage to have some level of discussion, both among participants and among panelists and between participants and the panelists, we have disabled the chat function for participants. The reason for that is that we want to make this a safe space, and we had some challenges in previous webinars with people coming here with hostile messages and hostile questions. That is the reason why there is a moderated Q&A section, but not an open chat. I hope that we'll be able to still have a good discussion in this webinar. From the flow, as I've said, Victor and Ymania are going to kick us off. Then we have a list of interveners with shorter interventions, and then we will have a question and answer and intervention section for all participants. In that piece, I will make everyone who wants to make an intervention, give them the floor so they can speak, and as well show their video if they want to. And then we'll wrap up hopefully in not more than 90 minutes. And without further ado, that was only 3 minutes, which is great. I'll give the floor to Victor.
Thank you very much, Julia. I trust that you can hear me well. Is it okay? Wonderful. Good morning, afternoon and evening to all. It's wonderful to see you both around my screen for those that are participating in the panel, and then I always do a quick check of those that are attending, and I see many names that I'm just delighted to see present here today. In the absence of personal contact, which is of course the optimal way of transmitting energy, just knowing that you're here makes me happy, because it means that you are well, and it really is wonderful to see you all here. We've all been having a number of conversations around COVID-19 in the last few weeks. And I believe that you know that when it comes to the mandate, I was very keen to place the mandate in a listening position during the first few weeks of the pandemic. I will humbly recognize that part of this was that I did not know exactly off the bat what was the optimal thing for the mandate to do in a situation that not I believe anybody else had ever experienced before, which is this class of global concern that basically derailed the activity of the world. And over the last 12 weeks, we've been in a process of dialogue with all of you, where we have been very much in a listening position. And I'm very thankful to all of you who have contributed or allowed us to be present in the fora where you have been discussing. And I would like to present to you what the mandate's overview is of this whole situation, and an overview we have been able to develop, although it might not have all of the nuance that might be required to explain in 7 minutes, but an overview we have been able to develop. And also I would like to share with you what are the next steps in the plan of action of the mandate. Having said that, none of this is ever written in stone. The reason why I actually take part in this kind of meetings is because I so highly value the opinions and informations that are expressed here, and we can always modify, change course, avoid mistakes by listening very actively to all of you. First of all, allow me to just take a moment to acknowledge the extraordinary resilience of this movement. It is, I believe, an event, a crisis that has taken all of the energies that were in store by a movement that was working already under duress, in many cases under very real threats, to actually scale up, and also, while not disregarding your common obligations, to include the response to the pandemic in the work that you have been doing. And I think that it is extraordinary the way that this movement has been able to respond, but also, in one hand, testimony of the ability, the flexibility of this movement, but on the other hand, the fundamental need that other stakeholders, particularly state actors, take note and fulfill their obligations in relation to this movement. That it is about time that there is a clear acknowledgement and value given to this movement around the world. I have classified the concerns connected to COVID-19 in 3 great areas, which is the methodology that the mandate is using to follow up on concerns. I will describe those 3 threads of work. The first one is actions that are destined to use the pandemic as an excuse, as a cover, or as a proxy for attacking communities, populations, and peoples. And under that, we have a number of situations that we're following in terms of legislation and administrative action that is being passed, that evidently has purposes other than the protection of public health, but that are being placed under the guise of COVID-19 because, of course, the state of emergency makes it more politically possible and expedient to address these matters. And of course, the Hungarian legislation is under that category. Issues such as the Ugandan raid are very well-known examples of this, in which we have gone the full cycle of denouncing, engaging the state, and then we will continue following up on the situation. The second type of situation is where states may not be actually aware or have not been diligent enough to make themselves aware of the indirect discrimination impact that a seemingly neutral measure may deploy. And we are gathering information in real time, constantly, about how impact can exist at the level of implementation, because either the design did not include good knowledge of the way that processes are carried out within the communities, or because the dynamics of the communities themselves are actually not well coordinated or responding well to the pandemic. And in this, there's a wide range of concerns that we have received. They relate, for example, to the increasing impact on the health of LGBT persons due to the reassignment of hospitals that were tending to persons living with HIV/AIDS, for example, which was supposed to be temporal, and it's now becoming permanent, and that means that these persons are actually having enormous difficulty accessing their ongoing treatment. It also goes to issues such as distribution of food and packages, which seemingly neutral, but in particular contexts might be very discriminatory depending on, for example, which organizations are chosen to carry out, and so on and so forth. Well, it's evident for all of us that these situations that I've described under paragraph 1 and 2 are very concerning and very grave. They can, in fact, be very damaging because they will be the cases in which most humiliating and most violent actions can be taken. But then we have the third thread, which is the thread that existed there before COVID-19 and has been exacerbated. The thread in which we are working on the permanent concerns of violence and discrimination on every day, and that now have just basically been pushed down the level of priority, both in public discourse and in official action, some 20 levels down. And I think that this is the level where we, of course, will have more intensity in the medium and long term. We're talking about social exclusion from all sectors of life. We're talking about all levels of violence, including, of course, police violence, incarceration, all of the phenomena that we know, and that has now been exacerbated with COVID. And Julia, here is where we are actually merging what it's to be known as the ongoing business of the mandate, and the impact of COVID-19. And for me, this is becoming a little bit of a message, which is COVID-19 will be here for a very long time. The mandate is kind of enabling itself to work with it as a reality, but understanding that all of the concerns in our communities, our populations continue to be there with more intensity than before, and that they need to be catered for. Very quick word, and with this I finish. As I think I mentioned this to you the other day, Julia, I have a friend in Latin America that always says, I'm going to begin wrapping up my first point when she's already 2 minutes over her time. So I won't do that, I'll wrap up. And I have 3 sentences. The first one is, I would like to convey to you what the mandate is going to be doing over the next few weeks and months in relation to this. The flagship of our strategy was the statement that, as you know, was issued by 96 special rapporteurs and commissioners. This is a flagship in the sense that it will continue being the basic statement in matters of policy. And as you know, that statement is strong to the effect that LGBT people are everywhere, and they must be understood to be part of every design, every diagnostic, every implementation, and every evaluation. Following that flagship, there is the initiative of a series of guidelines that I'm preparing and that I will be communicating to states. It is estimated that this will be issued on 8 June. And I will very kindly invite all civil society to study them, scrutinize them, use them if good, criticize them if bad, to make sure that we can provide that to out there. They have been entitled the Aspire Guidelines, and that's a mnemonic device that derives from the word that is made by the initial of the 6 keywords, which are acknowledge LGBT people are everywhere, support civil society, protect people. Indirect discrimination is a real risk, assess it. Representation is key, bring people in, and evidence must be collected and brought into the proper process of public policy. So the Aspire guidelines will be issued and sent to states on 8 June, and from then we will have a process of dissemination. I think that this is indeed good practice. It gathers good practice in relation to these issues. And finally, in this process, I can now announce that my report to the General Assembly at the end of this year is going to be on COVID-19 impact. And methodologically, it will not be very much of a secret how I'm going to do this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be taking the guidelines, and then I'm going to be gathering as much information as I can as to the way that states and others have performed in relation to that axis of work. I'm very much looking forward to this. I thank you very much for your patience and attention, and I look very much forward to the conversation. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you again for the very, very early hour that you're joining this call or this webinar. And I'll hand over directly to Ymania Brown, who is the Co-Secretary General of ILGA World. Ymania.
Thank you very much for that, Julia. First of all, I want to thank Victor for taking the time out. I know it's early morning for you in Costa Rica. And you know, our speakers that are lined up, thank you so much for your time, and also the attendees. This is the last in a series of webinars organized by ILGA World, so we really appreciate the sharing of spaces, the listening to each other's concerns and angst and voices. It's very heartwarming for us here at ILGA World. I'm supposed to say a few deep and meaningful things, but I'm actually at a loss. I have no idea. I'm just going to say things that come to my mind. Some kind of message from me as the co-secretary, one of the co-secretary generals of ILGA World. Look, all NGOs, including ILGA World, right, that is working in these sacred battlegrounds and spaces, you know, if they are not doing it now, they should at least consider, by working with their boards, to do some of the following. They should maybe look at adapting their programming to meet COVID-19, which will be around not just for this year, but it will be around for years to come. They need to be looking at adapting their strategies to address the increased violence and stigma and discrimination that is happening and will continue to happen in consultation with their stakeholders. But all the while, staying connected to their long-term vision. And I'll explain a little bit when I get a little into it a little bit further. But how do you do this is the $6 million question. For me, this is a time when we as activists rise up. We rise up, we focus, we refocus, we recalibrate, we readjust our strategic visions if it need be. So we focus our alignment to push for truly transformative advocacy, not just short-sighted visions. And it's part of the course now because we see it so many times now. COVID-19 this, COVID-19 that, you know. Don't buy the steak knives, read the fine print. You know, we focus on our decades and centuries long struggles that this is nothing new to us as LGBTI. Don't just pivot all your resources to be COVID-19 compliant for the sake of convenience. You, me, us, we were and continue to suffer these social injustices before COVID-19, and we will continue to suffer them after COVID-19. We focus on her story, their story, and our history, right? That these social injustices do not just disappear overnight. We are still fighting injustices and violence and discrimination for years that have been effected years ago, way before we even were born. We accept the reality that 4, 5, 6, 7 years from now, we will continue to be fighting COVID-19 injustices because, as you all know very well, fighting wars take time. And we may be beaten on so many fronts many times, but we will never be defeated in this war because there are other activists coming up after us, right? We focus, we recalibrate, we readjust on the diversions that are coming. States like Hungary, you know, stripping away trans rights was the first part. And guess who the government is coming after next? Women's rights. They're now beginning to crack down on laws against domestic violence, right? Now more than ever, we need to link, we need to weave, we need to truly practice intersectionality and joining other movements in our battles. Intersectionality is no longer a buzzword. Let's commit to put it in practice immediately. Let's link up to other movements, right? Because make no mistake, our position or our opposition, they want the gender binary maintained at all costs. And we, the LGBTI populations around the world, we threaten that. How many times as a trans woman in public have I been attacked with this, you know, gender ideology crap? You know, that myopic and dangerous view started with the religious right. And look around who the world leaders are that are using it to push anti-LGBTI agendas. Bolsonaro, Orban, Trump, right? Let's be mindful. Let's be mindful that there is a danger that we as activists and LGBTI populations and the UN and its mechanisms rush to chase the COVID-19 social injustices, and we are swept up in the newness and the freshness of the pain of these wounds on humanity, especially our LGBTI populations. And in doing so, we forget the older wounds that have been festering in our communities for a millennia, right? COVID-19 and its effects on our LGBTI populations is a class of symptoms manifesting themselves because we have not addressed the root causes of violence and discrimination in our communities. We have not. And don't be fooled by the messages that the emperor has new clothes. Yes, the emperor has new clothes, but we're still in dire need for decriminalization for the remaining 68, 69 or so countries. We still need other legislation to support how we own our own narratives and our bodies. We still need funding to combat the rise and surge in our significantly funded opposition. And my last thought is, while we are tending to our communities in COVID-19 times, yes, it's hard to find masks and food and shelter and money and safety. We cannot travel to tell and speak our truths at international fora, but let us not lose sight of the long-term vision and the war ahead of us. And to our members on the ground, you know, to all of you activists that are here and participating, everyone should respect the boundaries of activists, that we too are focused on our survival during COVID-19. We should all be mindful as NGOs of using and exploiting the pain we are suffering during COVID-19 for Insta likes, right? So thank you everyone for your time, and I yield the rest of my time to our speakers because I can't wait to hear about your contributions. And thank you, Julia, thank you, ILGA World, and thank you everyone for taking some time out to listen to myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Ymania. I think I could have listened for another 10 minutes easily. Unfortunately, time, of course, is always too short. And we do want to hear from a diverse set of persons who will now speak from various regional and topical perspectives, adding to complete the picture of both the impact and the response to this crisis. And I'll give the word to Mani Mitchel, who is a member of the ILGA World Board for the Oceanian region. Mani, the next 5 minutes are yours.
Thank you, Julia, and warm Pacific greetings to everyone. So, Mani Mitchel, I'm co-chair of ILGA Oceania. I'm an intersex person, a non-binary person. So I'll speak initially about the impact on our ILGA Oceania board. We're a volunteer board. ILGA put all of us into lockdown, so we were all working from home. So the first impact that we had was reduced internet access and connectivity, and that's really impacted our colleagues out in the Pacific who have not been able to join us during this time. Within the board, our small board, we have had people who, as I said, are all working from home. We've had members who have lost their jobs or had significant reductions in income. We've got people caring for family members. One of our members is looking after a group of elders and preparing meals every day. Half of our board have had to step up into significant jobs through their work and are involved in responding to the COVID epidemic at an organisational level in governments, so haven't been available as much to do the LGBTI work. Some of us have been impacted by mental health issues, and some of us are responding to the community. So the task that I have as a mental health professional, I will talk about shortly. So as we were preparing for this, I would say, and we've already covered this, in summary, this COVID disaster has simply amplified and exacerbated all the inequalities that already existed in our community. So what we're finding is the things that we already know about have just been made worse and more complicated. So that's the ILGA Oceania board. I will now speak to the work that I've been doing. So as I said, I'm an intersex person, and Victor, I know, but it pains me every time you have to say the alphabet soup, and the intersex community is not included in that. So we organised across Australia and New Zealand to work collaboratively. So we set up a support network, and myself and colleagues in Australia have been hosting that 3 times a week. We also realised that we needed to get some specific medical information out to the community. So the intersex community is very well connected around the world. So we utilised all our connections and pulled together information to support our community. So we've been doing what we can. What I do know is that our community at all levels is under stress. And I think one of the things that I would like to end on as a mental health professional is thinking today how we can support each other, have each other's back, because I think what you just said, Ymania and Victor, this being long haul, this is not going to go away in 5 minutes. I think we pull on the knowledge that exists in our community. So we have been through an epidemic. We have the AIDS information in our community narrative. So I think we can draw on that and inform how we get through this, yes, Ymania, in a very fierce, activated way, but also in a way so that we don't fall over and burn out with the overwhelming complexity of this task. It's a real privilege to be talking with you all tonight. I will end now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mani, for that intervention. And we stay in Oceania. The next person who's going to speak is Vanessa Lee, who is an ILGA World Board alternate from Oceania. Vanessa, the webinar is yours.
Oh, hi guys. I'm Vanessa. Adjust that camera there. I'm a social epidemiologist in medicine, as well as I'm the alternate chair for ILGA Oceania. My pronouns are his and her. Sorry, she and he, she and her are my pronouns. Sorry. So I'm just going to give you a quick update on the Pacifica region for Oceania. So there's been 292 cases in the Pacific Island regions with 7 deaths. There are 6 countries with the cases, the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, Papua New Guinea, Fiji, French Polynesia, Guam, and New Caledonia. French Polynesia has not reported new cases for at least one incubation period, which is 14 days per incubation period. Fiji and Papua New Guinea have not reported new cases for at least 2 weeks now, 2 incubation periods, sorry, 28 days, which is a month. New Caledonia has not reported any new cases for at least 3 incubation periods, 42 days, and the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas and Guam have reported new cases in the past 14 days. The other thing to remember is that of the 22 countries in the Pacific, there is only 5 countries with level 2 labs to deliver testing and helping people with the virus and to control the virus and helping people into recovery. Those countries are Fiji, New Caledonia, Papua New Guinea and Guam. Papua New Guinea, as people are aware on the world map, Indonesia comes down, Papua New Guinea, and then as you come down, it comes down to the top of Australia. There's a high prevalence of Indigenous people all through the top of Australia and Indigenous people all the way through Papua New Guinea and all the way back up. The virus has started hitting, coming down from Indonesia and hitting the top area of Papua New Guinea. If it starts coming down the province of Papua New Guinea, it stands to, there's not enough hospitals. It stands to wipe out quite a population of people coming down through the Torres Strait and Cape York and then across to the Northern Territory. So, and per land mass, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are quite high in the Northern Territory. However, by population mass, New South Wales has the highest number of Indigenous people, and then Queensland has the second highest. So either way it goes, it's quite a devastation the way that the virus, if the virus isn't controlled. For LGBTQI people in those areas, what we're finding is that, as has already been mentioned by Ymania and Victor and Manny, is that you know, people are experiencing homophobia on such a different level now. We're seeing that a lot of the sister girls or transgenders and brother boys are not attending services because the discrimination has just hit a whole new level of racism and xenophobia, and they're just so they're not attending the services, which is fearful because we don't know how long somebody may have the virus. We are also seeing increase in domestic family violence and other social issues. The other concerning issue is that due to the increased racism and the next levels of racism and discrimination that people are experiencing, especially considering that these vulnerable populations have high levels of cancer rates, cardiovascular disease, and this is all through the Pacific as well. We also have high cancer rates and high HIV rates in these population groups. So we're also seeing increases of they become much more susceptible to obtaining the virus, and the incubation period in Australia at the moment, we just had someone diagnosed with the virus after 10 weeks. So you can be asymptomatic for nearly 10 to 14 weeks and nobody knows you've got the virus. A young man died yesterday at 30 years old. 2 schools were closed this week. So we're starting to see that the virus can actually transfer itself across different age groups and different populations, which is really, really concerning. The other thing that I just want to mention is that, you know, I think there's an opportunity here, you know, when we talk about past issues, you know, never have we seen anywhere on death certificates in the world that I'm aware of that somebody can identify as LGBT. And I think this is an opportunity where we should actually put that in and ask for countries to have it on death certificates. You can have the opportunity on a death certificate to have your organs donated, but should you die, they still classify you as a male or female. And I think people should have the opportunity, and this is quite serious. We should have that opportunity. We don't need to have that extra trauma of passing away from this virus and you know, not being our true selves, not being our identity. So I think there's an opportunity for that to be questioned in death data. There's also across the Pacific, one thing I'll say before I finish, is there's been an increase in women's roles on attendance of the COVID-19. Women have now, and so well, I'm saying this about women because we don't know if they're identifying as bi or lesbian or trans women or who they're identifying as, but we're seeing this, women are now becoming the primary caregivers, women are now becoming the key frontline responders. I know that a lot of the Samoa and the Pacifica, quite often we see the Whawhawhine and a lot of transgender across Indigenous communities as well take on those roles as caregivers and frontline workers, frontline respondents, and there's nothing in place to support them, to keep them safe. We also know that women are engaged in decision making, but not in the leadership. And you know, this is really concerning for the LGBT population because we're seeing gender-based violence escalating across the different communities in the Pacifica. We're also seeing that this is an added trauma on post-traumatic stress disorder, and you know.
Vanessa,
so
you will have to come to an end because there's another.
Okay, thank you. I'm finished.
Well, you can finish the sentence. I didn't want to finish the sentence, and then we'll move to the next one.
Okay, so we're seeing that escalated across the different countries, and so, but we're not seeing the services put in place to support people, and we need to start seeing those services put in place. So that's what we're advocating for.
Thanks, Vanessa, and thanks for adding a gender dimension to that conversation, which I think is an important dimension to be discussed. Then maybe one quick intervention on Q&A. So we are already receiving the first questions. We'll try to make sure that we'll answer all of those during the course of this webinar. So if you have a question, just send it to us, and we'll try to make sure to respond to all of those before we end in a little bit less than an hour. So our next speaker is Martin Karadzhov. Martin is the ILGA World Youth Chair. So we're leaving Oceania and coming to a substantive issue. Martin, the next 5 minutes are yours.
Hi everyone, I'm just checking if you can hear me. Yes, great. My name is Martin, he, him, and I'm the chair of the youth committee at ILGA World. I also lead LGBTIQ youth service in London, supporting young people, and I work also for the UK membership and umbrella body for the LGBTI sector in the UK, working with all the London LGBTI charities and groups and organizations. So today, isolation is not new to many queer young people, and many of us, as we know, grow up experiencing it and living it. But this has presented some additional challenges for all of us, and in terms of discrimination for many of the young people across the world. And I'll focus on the impact of queer young people particularly has. I know some of you already heard of me talking about this before, but I think we don't hear about it enough, so I'll kind of highlight those issues as well again. So even before COVID-19 happened, LGBT issues have been sidelined and invisible on SRHR, SOGI-esque conversations on national, regional, and global level. And quite often, those issues were not given the enough attention they should have. They were deemed as too political, too controversial to be raised and discussed. And when they hit the spotlight, really, it was usually for the wrong reasons. Taking into account, actually, that despite being the largest part of the world's population, in general, young people, which is over 50%, we know youth are really underrepresented in decision-making and politics, and that's under 2%, really. And LGBTI youth further lack that presence for many reasons, such as risk, fear of being discriminated, not being out, and others. And that's not only at national, global level and just in general, but also including in our civil society organizations that are LGBTI specific. Young people are not given these platforms. But this current crisis has sidelined further those voices. It has driven really the LGBTIQ plus youth more in the shadows of inequality conversations. And when we ask ourselves, what does really being LGBTIQ or growing up under COVID-19 looks like, it's really hard to answer unless you're a young person and you share that. So because if you look into the evidence, there's not really enough LGBTIQ specific evidence out there except some organizations leading their own needs assessment work particularly. Queer young people in general, we also rely on safe and inclusive LGBTI centers, groups and specialist support that affirm identities, the people who can be who they are and can relate and learn, socialize in safe environment. But large part of LGBTI youth organizations and groups are really voluntary-led, operating with zero finances, and some of them move digitally with all this crisis, but many of them have really had to close down. Mine had the privilege to actually move some of its services, but I'm aware of many others who really didn't have the capacity and had to close, which again highlights the digital exclusion impacts young people too, which often don't hear in this part of the conversations. Many queer young people are trapped in households, as you mentioned earlier, with abusive families and partners with no support available. We see increase of violence. Young people continue to be kicked out despite the pandemic, which particularly impacts as well trans young people and non-binary young people and gender diverse people of color as well. Also, young people are spending more time on online, which means highly likely to face bullying and online abuse, and which is not really tackled at the moment with the increasing lack of capacity of organizations. You face huge LGBTI youth just faces financial insecurity like other groups, but youth unemployment are skyrocketing and the lack of basic needs and food and medicine is seen across. We don't talk about grief either. I see a lot, many of us experiencing grief at the moment, losing close ones, but many young people, grief is new and complicated to navigate really in this climate, and there's no enough again support to look at that. We know that queer young people are also disproportionately impacted by homelessness, but COVID-19 has exposed also so-called hidden homelessness as well, where queer youth with no housing, especially in large cities across the world, are constantly on the move. They sleep on buses, use apps to hook up, sleep at strangers' houses, but they can't do that anymore. So that exposes actually a further hidden homelessness that existed before the crisis. They also can't go to general shelters as they are not inclusive and they can face abuse. And where they go to the LGBTI shelters, they might be under attack as well, such as the case in Uganda, like you mentioned. With decreased support and services to treatments where young people with decreased access to support and services and treatment, young non-binary and trans people are particularly impacted by this. They're facing additional strain on already significant poor mental health, which might result in a long-term impact. There's dangerous trend as well. As you mentioned, Victor, there's a few dangerous trends as well that you see. One of them is the Hungary example that I'm sure will be covered again. But also there's another trend which is looking at particularly like places, for example, the UK, where progressive gender recognition reform was due to happen this year. After a series of consultation was supposed to change the law to make it more inclusive. The Minister of Women and Equalities has announced really recently a U-turn to restrict healthcare access of trans children and young people, damaging potentially generations with regressive decisions in these places. This message is quite troubling, that even in places like this where we're supposed to progressive decisions and reforms to happen, they might be under threat as well. More than ever, civil society organizations are vital in tackling this, and strong networks of organizations are important to advocate. I work for an infrastructure body, and I really value the importance of those networks. Safe online spaces for queer youth are crucial to remain connected, but not enough. Many of the decisions that are being made now, young people will have to live with potentially for decades. And yeah, youth, and particularly LGBT young people, are not involved in decision-making in the community, and state responses is not being consulted with them. That includes our own communities as well, that not really necessarily include queer youth. Moving forward, we need to ensure more than ever that the youth voices are not only included, but have an active part in the decision-making process, and that will impact their lives. But providing space and structures for them to advocate and co-produce, whether they are online or not. Because otherwise, we are really risking seeing an LGBT youth generation further marginalized with less say on shaping their futures. That's it from me on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, for that youth perspective and the lack of capacity, the grief, as well as the lack of decision-making agency among young people, and particularly LGBTI youth. From the topic of youth, we move back to Asia, where we have Charbel Maydaa on this webinar, who is the ILGA World Board alternate for the Asian region. Charbel, floor is yours.
Hello. Thank you. Well, I will try to be really short, but because we did a lot of meetings with our members from all over Asia, and really I know I'm really sorry for nagging right now, but we should share with you all what we got from them and what we are trying to do also. I will divide my talk on different levels, like mental health and health support, social support, economic support, organization support, political, governmental, and religious support. So we'll start with the first thing. There's a huge need all over our region for psychosocial support, and we've receiving a lot of new cases of people stuck at their home with their family, especially like young LGBTIQ people, suffering from different type of abuse. Even in some cases, they don't have the space and the ability to use their phones or for counseling or therapy sessions that we are trying to do in this period, like online session, etc. In some countries like India, governments have taken a measure to take care of the mental health issues, for example, of transgender people, but proven ineffective. People living with HIV cannot access proper healthcare also and medicine. And all the NGOs start to receive emergency calls from people with suicidal thoughts. And we believe that it's causing with the high numbers, it's a huge number, and it's basically the financial situation globally. It's directly related to this highest number of people, because now we're not only like fighting COVID, we're fighting the society, and as LGBTIQ also we're fighting poverty. So it's really difficult for everybody, and specifically for vulnerable people. We also see an increased number of people who are kicked out of their home, some because of financial issues, but a lot because of domestic violence. We have I tried really to bring things from all over our region, things in common. We're suffering from a huge lack of access to medication, and some people, especially trans people, are trying to prioritize where to spend their money. In some cases, it's either to eat or to buy medication. So they are, I don't know, they want to survive. So they don't care now about their medications or hormones or whatever, but they focus on to like day by day to survive. And especially because in like 80% of our country, we have a zero governmental support for COVID-19 in general for the whole society, and specifically I will mention after like why also like, it's more affecting LGBTIQ community. A lot of our activists and groups, they don't have the core funding, or the groups are informal collective. They feel useless because of the limitation that they have, and also they start to look for alternative, but it's a long way to go for them. We have a lot of difficulty to approach other non-LGBT organizations for economical help, especially that those organizations usually are related to a political party or religious party or religion, and LGBTIQ people are not welcome there, or really they are afraid to go and seek help in such places. Well, all our organization in this region, we're trying to shift our fund when donors are flexible in some cases. Even NGOs who don't have expertise or they don't work usually in services, they started because of the need, and they started applying for different funds. Well, but the most important thing what we are suffering from right now, it's like very political and very governmental organized. Like we need, with all what's happening with COVID-19 all over the globe, specifically in our region, really we need to, I don't know, to get energy to respond for the attack that starts. Like response or attack challenge on advocacy level during this period, where all public discourse is focused on COVID-19 COVID impact to continue harassing the momentum built previously illegal policy advocacy, so that progress is not lost. We should focus on this. Like Iran, South Korea, conservative Christian in Lebanon recently, like really very silly talks about like it's caused by perverts like us, LGBT people, etc., etc. And some people try, like, because of the, I don't know what's the relation between this pandemic and having, like, people are trying to have a special connection with God, and they start to believe those religious leaders saying like, yeah, it's caused because you agree on 1, 2, 3, and you're giving space for LGBTIQ people, etc., etc. So yeah, in some places they said that LGBTIQ organizations are excluded from support also provided by the government and the donors. I totally agree with Ymania, and I want really to focus on 2 things on the end. I will be very short. Religious leaders and conservatives in our region, despite they are Muslim, Christian, or whatever, are really taking advantage to steal from us even the support that we built with our society, not changing the law, not even the, really what we have in our region mostly, like in the half of it, it's like just support that we built with our society, like some deconstruction from, you know, a little bit of culture thing, and they are trying to steal it. What we should do, I believe, it's like have a clear plan on, to this on a global level, not only on county by county level. And what I really want to, I don't know, to emphasize on is like for the future, and we like it or not, we are like LGBTIQ community, and especially like people with non-privilege, like poor people or people who are not known as activists, etc. They are suffering in our region because I believe it was our fault at some point, because we didn't have like an action plan to respond to emergency, and like despite what kind of emergencies, not only attack on LGBTIQ people, but now, and I felt that we are so vulnerable to whatever happening to this world, and we should have like clear like plan for the future to try to escape what's happening now with our LGBTIQ plus community. We should have like clear plan how to respond in case of emergency, and where to put our efforts on, like very quickly and not taking a lot of time, but which is what's happening now. Thank you.
Thank you, Charbel, for ending on a future perspective note. The next person I have on the speakers list is Katrin, who's the Advocacy Director at ILGA-Europe. Katrin, the next 5 minutes are yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, a lot has been said, and I think I just want to start at we talked a lot about how the current crisis is exacerbating existing inequalities. And I think also at the heart of the crisis is, once again, power, and we know that from all the work we're doing. So it's the power about who's heard, whose interests are protected, and who has the capacity to advocate that their specific situation is actually taken into account. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that while I think in a round like this, we all are very aware of the specific impact on LGBTI people, on LGBTI organizations of the COVID-19, what we have realized in recent weeks, in conversations with, you know, broader human rights institutions, governments, EU, Council of Europe, UN institutions, is that if the impact on minorities of the crisis is taken into account, we very often hear, yeah, but we don't hear a lot about the impact on the LGBTI community. Our researchers on the ground don't really report about the impact of the LGBTI community. And I think this is where we need to really remind everyone why that is. It is because LGBTI organizations are reinventing themselves as food bank, and that's strongly impacting on their ability to actually advocate and to campaign. Just among one of the reasons. So in what I'm going to say, I really want to focus on both the impact on the LGBTI community, on people, but also the impact on organizations and how we need to take that into account. At ILGA-Europe, we've been, since the beginning of the crisis, of course, been in ongoing contact with members, really assessing needs, and looking at the impact. And we have a dedicated website on COVID-19, where really you'll find a lot of resources. On the one hand, a compilation on the impact of a bit of what I'm going to go into, but also, for example, an overview over what are actually the obligations of states when they're taking human rights derogations. Things like they need to be time limited. How are we moving out of these derogations again? But then also very practical support for organizations around online safety, for example, online financial management and things like that we really saw as needs. And I think linking up to what Ymania said at the very beginning, we call that package protect, adapt, and rally, because what we felt, yes, in the very first instance, LGBTI activists need to protect themselves, they need to protect the community, but then we need to adapt, as you said, but adapt looking forward, and we need to rally together of what's next and how we're actually moving out of that crisis towards a more sustainable society and more equality. So I just very quickly want to go through some of the specific impacts we've seen of COVID-19 and of the measures that have been taken. And we talked already about exacerbation of existing discrimination. And I think we see that in lockdown measures. I mean, lockdown measures have been policed all across Europe and Central Asia. And that has led to, for example, same-sex couples being questioned / harassed by the police about not respecting social distancing measures when walking in the streets. And I think it's important to say that, we hear these reports from Poland, but we also hear them from Brussels. So there is no divide, actually. This is still taking place all across Europe, and we need to look very closely. The same goes for trans people. I mean, any police control where your ID documents are not matching your gender identity obviously expose you to harassment, in the worst cases violence. Again, this is a situation with increased policing of lockdown measures is at a much higher risk and happening much more often. We already talked a little bit about domestic violence, and there's a big focus on conversations around domestic violence and violence against women in the crisis, and rightly so. It's really, really important. However, we really also have to take into consideration the many stories we hear of young LGBTI people finding themselves trapped in hostile lockdown family situations, the stress, the mental health issue that brings, and also the violence that can bring. Also elderly LGBTI people trapped in hostile care situations that usually they still have a way to, find strategies to deal with that might not be possible yet. So we are working on a clear call to that actually any kind of policy response to domestic violence specifically includes the situation of LGBTI people and expressively reaches out to the LGBTI community in offering services. We already talked about access to healthcare. Again, this is something we see very clearly across Europe and Central Asia. So transition related medical healthcare not being considered vital without any case-to-case assessment. Hormone treatment, I already have to wrap up, okay. Okay, I'll be very straight.
You're already over time.
I'll be very straight. So hormone therapy is not being guaranteed. We hear a lot about testing, HIV testing being stopped in various countries. And also, intersex people very often travel distances actually to get specialized and trusted healthcare, which might not be possible yet. One word on relocation to safety. We have heard of situations where people had already arranged to the country in Azerbaijan, for example, to get into safety, and due to borders being closed down, that was not possible. I wanted to talk about precarity, and I know Luca will, so I'll cut that very short, but we talked about the high rates of homelessness among young LGBTI people, and that being a situation that's a lot worsened now. And really, a lot of our member organizations are reinventing themselves as food banks at the moment. We've mentioned rising attacks on LGBTI rights. So yes, we have seen hate speech by political leaders, by religious leaders, by government. And again, it's across the board from Turkey to the Ukraine to Poland to Italy, Northern Ireland, and we need to stand up very strongly against that. We've talked about the government using the crisis. Hungary, I think it was no surprise also that in Poland, the government retabled the ban on abortion and sex education in schools at the time when they prevented protests in the streets through lockdown measures. We've heard from France that IVF, the law on IVF treatment will be postponed. And it was already mentioned as well by, before the postponement in the UK and the very worrying announcements there. Can I say one word, Julia, about the impact on organizations? I'll make it
one sentence, but it's gonna cut on the other speakers. But one sentence.
Sorry. So just to really say, organizations have no sustainable financial base all across Europe and Central Asia, as in other parts of the world, and we know that. A lot of the funding is relying on activities that are now not taking place, and that means they can't continue to pay overheads costs. Sponsorships are cancelled when events are being taken online, and income generating services cannot be done. So the situation is even more difficult for LGBTI organizations at the moment. And I think we need to take that into account, really the ability to raise all the issues in moving out of the crisis. Victor talked about human rights and LGBTI rights moving down the scale. And we need to really come up with a strong discourse altogether on why human rights and equality need to be at the core of any recovery measures and any rallying forwards. Thank you, and sorry for being over time.
All right. Thank you, Katrin, and thanks for adding the organizational dimension, which is important, I think, because if the civil society falters, the community is the next to falter, I suppose. The next speaker whom we have on our list is Simran Shaik, who will add a perspective from a trans activist from India. Simran, next 5 minutes are yours.
Thank you so much, Julia. I'll be really very quick. Am I audible? Yeah, okay. So I'll be really very quick, keeping the time frame in mindset. So I just wanted to start because majority of the speakers have already presented their intervention in a manner which is, very difficult for the last speakers to really come up with a good interventions. So I'm not going to repeat what has already been said. That does not mean that I'm limiting and my focus is not on those perspectives. But very quickly, I just wanted to let you all know that as everyone on this call is aware about India being a mini continent rather than a country, with the second highest populated country across the world, the current COVID response is in such a manner that I just Googled it and I found it a fractions of minute back that 160,000 active cases we have of COVID positive. 65,000 of those people have been cured and sent back from the quarantine centers and from the hospitals, and roughly around 4,500 people have lost their lives due to this pandemic. Now, if you ask me what is the ratio or what is the same typology when we talk about LGBTQI, I'm sorry, I don't have that. There's nowhere mentioned. That's the first point that I really wanted to flag. I just wanted to retaliate what Ymania just mentioned during her opening remarks that, we have been facing all this while. It will be there and it will go on, as she correctly mentioned, and we have that in spirit of us that, daily, constantly, we keep on fighting with it. No doubts about it. But such kind of pandemics, which is emergingly hitting, does disturb your normal routine activism. It does not stand with the constant mode or pre-planned mode. It comes all of a sudden and it becomes really very difficult to then face it. Many people talked about what are the challenges, of course, the home quarantines, making lives of LGBTQI very miserable. Among the LGBTQI spectrum, I just also wanted to flag that 79% of transgender women in India are dependent on sex work and begging. And rest of the other side of the coin of the transgender people are either NGO workers, the healthcare professions, or they work with some sort of a daily wages kind of a thing. But the majority chunk is in sex work. Now we all can imagine and understand how we are sort of facing the situation. I am on a daily stand of hand to mouth, and how difficult it becomes when it is more than 62 days in total in India when the entire pandemic is going on. Of course, we have all this LGBTQI civil societies and NGOs who are supporting. My dear friends, we are talking about a population of 1.32 billion population across India. Sorry, I don't know what you say with billion or million, but it's the second largest populated country. So we can really imagine the core population of LGBTQI who has been directly impacted. I think majority of the healthcares, the entire scenario is being covered by rest of the speakers. I just wanted to take last final minute. I think it's high time to also come up with solutions that we are seeing. This was the negative side. The positive sides is no matter whatever happens, the folks at the ground are going and supporting the LGBTQI, and it's the LGBTQI who is supporting the LGBTQI at the ground level. It could be with basic simplicity of providing dry rations, or maybe the PPE kits, or maybe the sanitization, the hygiene factor, or even a small pictorial GIFs, which is fairly available on your WhatsApp to tell you how important it is to just wash your hand during this pandemic, which is very informative and educative for the trans folks in India. With that statement, I end my intervention. Thank you,
Simran, and thanks for reminding us of the importance of LGBTI inclusive humanitarian aid, because otherwise those 79% of trans women living in sex work and from begging won't be reached by that. We move on to Brenda Algiri, from who's a member of the ILGA World Women Committee from the Asian region.
Yeah.
Brenda.
Yes, it's Alegre. Alegre. Yes. Mabuhay, and good afternoon to everyone. I would like to also extend my congratulations to Marie. I couldn't pronounce her last name because it's in French, but she's the first elected trans mayor in France. So it's a reason to celebrate for all of us. Now, in terms of the situations of trans people, particularly of trans women in some parts of Asia, like in Thailand and in the Philippines, one source of income for trans women would be beauty pageants, and other would be sex work. So unfortunately, in both cases, it's very difficult these days. The closest to a workaround, at least in one area, like for beauty pageants, is holding the beauty pageants online. So believe it or not, it's actually made possible, but hopefully it will not be the situation for good, you know. But it has worked so far. A couple of beauty pageants, online beauty pageants, have been successfully staged online, and it was helpful because it gave more trans women a chance to actually participate in the comfort of their own homes during the COVID lockdown and quarantine period. And the best part of that is that because there are sponsored prices, it would be it was able to support and suffice their need during these times. But these are only temporary fixes at the moment, because although beauty pageants thrive in Thailand and in the Philippines, we cannot expect online beauty pageants to keep happening on a regular basis. So hopefully employment issues for LGBT people will be addressed by our local governments, and consider it also as a priority. But it's been very difficult for us, particularly in the Philippines, because we don't have gender recognition laws. In Hong Kong, it's also been more difficult because apart from not having a gender recognition law, apart from other protective laws that are pending at the Hong Kong LegCo, Hong Kong is also facing a political situation with China. And I think it will grave, for me as an LGBT person living in Hong Kong, I feel that I'm also threatened by the proposed national security law, because I'm assuming, because I teach gender and sexuality to so many students, and a lot of my students are from mainland China. So at this point, I couldn't help but fear that I might be perceived as a threat of some form to the security, to the ideals of security of Hong Kong and China, because if they pursue this national security law. So it is an issue that we are looking into. So apart from beauty pageants and apart from the security issues in Hong Kong, hormones is also an issue lately. Just for you to know, like in the case of Thailand and in the Philippines, some trans people are able to purchase their hormones over the counter without prescription or without medical supervision. It is not the ideal situation or setup, but it has worked over the years because it is the situation. But it's become particularly more difficult lately because now, because of the stricter implementation of dispensation of medicines or drugs in these countries, they have started to question why some trans people are purchasing hormones over the counter without medication. And unfortunately, they could not get medication. So at the moment, we don't have an intervention, but we're raising this as a concern that can grow over time because of COVID. In terms of something with intervention, our organization in the Philippines, STRAP, has partnered with AIDS Society for fundraising. So we have just launched our invitational and promotional materials. We've posted it in some avenues online, like the ILGA World Trans Steering Committee page and the ILGA Asia page, and hopefully you could help us as well promote it, and hopefully we could raise funds, because what the funds we will raise will automatically go to the trans community that needs financial support during these times, because unemployment is such a grave issue for many of us here. On the positive side, or on a positive note, we realized that actually pride events that are held virtually would still work. So I have participated in a few online pride events, and there are upcoming pride events, virtual pride events this coming June. And so it gives me hope that this temporary setup, or this new normal, as they say, would still be an avenue to raise awareness for the issues of LGBTQI+ people in our respective countries or region in some other ways. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Brenda, for that intervention. And I will move on to the second last speaker, who is Luca Stevenson from the International Committee on the Rights of Sex Workers. Luca, floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. So organization represent 100 organizations in Europe and Asia. As you have heard from Simran and others, the impact of COVID-19 on LGBTIQ sex workers has been very dramatic. Even before a lockdown and a travel restriction were implemented, many sex workers lost most or all of their income because the clients stopped coming and paying for their services. After the lockdown, it went even worse, with many sex workers haven't been able to work and get any money for the last 2 months. This has an impact on housing, for example, with an increase of like homelessness of sex workers, etc. So there's a real sense of emergency in the community. And what has been really shocking is to see that although in many countries sex work is recognized as work, there's been no support from governments for sex workers, LGBTI or not. What happened is that many sex worker organizations organized their own fundraiser and were able to support sex workers directly this way. And the situation is really dramatic. You might have seen that there was a case, for example, in Georgia, where a young trans sex worker set herself on fire to protest the treatment from authorities against trans people and sex workers. And this is really a situation that is widespread all over the region. However, like the work that organizations have been doing is absolutely unbelievable. It really gives hope of how strong our community is. Just to take one example, for example, in France, Accept-ST, who works specifically with trans migrant women, mostly from Latin America, but not only, has done distributing food and funding, etc., to hundreds and hundreds of trans sex workers in Paris. What is sad is that the governments in many countries won't recognize the work that this organization have been doing, and again, this work is going to be invisibilized. If sex workers have been able to stop working, it's because they were able to get some support from our community directly. Otherwise, they would have to continue working, put themselves in danger, and also being at risk of like propagating the virus. What I found also extremely shocking is that some governments have taken this opportunity to actually push for more criminalization of sex work, which is something that we oppose completely. For example, some international organizations like ODIHR have organized a webinar on the relation between COVID, trafficking, and the porn industry. Yes, many sex workers have turned to online sex work to make ends meet, which is a very difficult occupation for anyone who tries to do sell sex online. But to make a link between the porn industry and trafficking at the moment where people are struggling to survive is really cynical. And the same in France. At the moment, there is a law in France called Loi Avia, which is also being pushed to criminalize online sex work, basically, under hate crime. It's also really going to have a negative impact on sex workers. ICRSE, we made a list of demands which are available on a website called Red Light COVID-Europe, which have been endorsed by many organizations. And we haven't heard back from the European Commission yet. I'm sure they're very busy, and as usual, sex workers are not a priority. I wanted to finish with just one thing. We really encourage all LGBTI organizations to reach out to sex worker group and see how they can work in partnership. This is extremely important because the criminalization of sex work is used not just against sex workers. For example, I received recently the news that in Cameroon, for Idaho, 42 trans people had been raided and arrested during a ceremony. And the legal justification for these raids were pimping laws. So under the guise of pimping, these 42 trans people had been arrested in Cameroon and faced really horrible treatment. So the laws on sex work are used not just against sex workers, but against the LGBTI community at large. And I also had a final message. We really struggle to push back this wave of criminalization in Europe. That really made precarious sex workers even more, including trans and migrant sex workers. And we really want to call on all organizations, including LGBTI organizations, to stop sharing platforms with organizations and individuals who are abolitionists. For us, there is no middle ground. Abolitionist is pro-criminalization. Pro-criminalization is endangering LGBTI sex workers. If you stand for the LGBTI community, you should really call out on your allies who are calling for more criminalization of our industry. And that's all I had to say, and thanks again for the invitation.
Thanks, Luca, for being so spot on and to the point. We'll have our last speaker, and maybe I should mention we've already answered one question in the chat to everyone. We'll have a couple of other questions which we'll address after this first round of speakers, and then I'll open very shortly for interventions from the participants before we wrap up, probably a little bit like 10 minutes after the given time. But first, we'll hear our last speaker, our last set speaker, Erika Castellanos from GATE, Transgender Diverse and Intersex Advocacy in Action. Erika, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Julia. And as said by everybody, you know, the impact of COVID that we have seen it in our organizations and in our communities. I'm gonna have an emphasis on trans perspective, but it doesn't mean that these things don't apply to the wider LGBTQI community. So we launched a survey, and we're in constant contact with our peers and partners and countries and activists all around the world. And we have seen issues of isolation further being, exacerbated into our communities. Our communities have historically been isolated, and with COVID and the measures countries are taking, it has created more discrimination. We see many trans people having issues around income generating, around a lot of violence around trans people having to stay at home, in many times in homes that they're not welcome and not loved and appreciated. The movement conditions that some countries have adopted based on gender, it's particularly problematic to trans people, but also it has exacerbated the health needs of our community, hormone therapy, psychological needs, HIV, but in all other areas of health. And with the world going in an online virtual platform, we see issues of complete abandonment and complete exclusion of some of our community members because of lack of connectivity, because of lack of data and internet. These issues around human rights violations and countries taking COVID as an excuse to actually further discriminate and create policies that completely exclude us and discriminate us. It's happening more and more. And this is even more when we see trans people, for example, who do sex work, or trans people who use drugs, who are unable to have a living or actually access opioid restitution therapy. For our organizations, including us as GATE, it has caused a major disruption of work. And it's very hard, but it has called to have a balance between what is possible and what the donors are demanding from organizations. And it demands that we have an open dialogue. Unfortunately, not all donors are open to have a sincere dialogue that takes in consideration the realities of organizations. A huge problem is around finances, but not just immediate finances. We need to look at the future of financing for our organization and how we can continue providing critical service amidst this crisis. One thing that has happened is the complete exclusion from decision-making platforms from the trans community at country level, regional, but also at global level, with the excuse of we cannot bring you together, and with also the excuse that we don't have access to data. And many of us have responded greatly and have done a lot of things. We see that many organizations, including us, has had to do a full realignment of work and our priorities and objectives, while still maintaining the essence of who we really are. So we have looked at innovative ways of reaching our goals. So doing capacity building, doing trainings in an online manner, and heavily relying on online work. Balancing of employee and staff needs and challenges with work objectives. So how do we continue to be productive, but at the same time take care and address the well-being of our staff? And also one of the things we need to start doing is sustainability planning. We also must be aware that as organizations, we cannot always solve all the issues. And that is something that overloads us, the great need of our community, and sometimes as organization not being able to solve every single need. We need to reach that level of acceptance. There are many surveys out there, and this is kind of like, it's more like a criticism to our whole movement, because we fail to work together. Every organization at local, national, regional, global level, we all took out surveys of COVID-19. And we have failed in a way to work together, putting more pressure on our community to answer 1 million surveys. I think one of the most pressing issues and threats that we need to address is the huge amount of information that is available, and frequently conflicting information around COVID. So some countries say use a mask, the others do not. Some countries go to lockdown, others do not. And this is as a result of many countries looking at COVID in a heterogeneous way. While we know that COVID affects communities, populations, countries, and regions in very different manner. Resources for both human and financials of our organizations, this is an issue that we need to address, the financial crisis that is happening now, but that will come post-COVID. And look at the mental and physical well-being. We need to start looking at our ways of working together as a community and aligning at the organization's objectives, looking who else has the same line of thinking. And there is a huge risk of how countries address the epidemic. So it is really important that we insert ourselves in decision making. There's also a huge risk at the moment that because there's so much attention to COVID and so much resources being moved to COVID, other health issues or social issues are gonna suffer huge financial cuts. And we will start seeing a lot of these issues coming up in the next month and year. So some possible strategies to respond in the long term and the implications of COVID would be, it's important that we need to document all issues, but it's important for all of us to share the data, to share the information. Don't take complete ownership, because after all, this is data coming from our peers. It's important to open our ears, to listen to the emerging needs of our community. Things change by the day, by the hour. So it's important to listen, what are the needs? It will be important to have a funding diversification, not be narrow-sighted around where we can access funding and how we can access funding. But also hugely important is to get involved, is to insert ourselves, even if when we are not called or not wanted, and advocate to be in levels of decision-making, particularly and including to issues around COVID and emergencies. And we need to be ready for the next pandemic. So few of us had ever thought about health security. I think it's time that all of our organizations take into consideration emerging emergencies and health security in our work plan and in our future plans. We need to take advantage of the situation also. While we know that we have forever suffered discrimination and isolation, now there's a lot of documentation happening. So let's take advantage that finally people are realizing, oh, trans people are being isolated, LGBT people are suffering. We've always done that, and they have never admitted. But when we have more and more data coming out, then we need to take up advantage of that. Finally, I think we need to take the lessons learned from the HIV epidemic. Early in the HIV epidemic, it was the community people, the response, and how we, the LGBTI community, led the response and fierce advocacy that has made us arrive where we are in the AIDS epidemic. Now we are able, I think we are able to do that as a community and lead advocacy from a human rights approach and expand to other areas in human rights beyond HIV, beyond COVID, but it's important to take the lessons learned from the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Erika, for your intervention. And we will take another 10 minutes for responses to Q&A. And I'll, if there is a appetite for that, I will as well, we'll open the floor for interventions. Katrin is the first one to answer a question on hate speech in Turkey.
So yes, Turkey was one of the examples I mentioned before where there was hate speech. I think the question was how to support. At ILGA-Europe, we've issued a statement together with other human rights organizations, and maybe I can just share it on the chat and ask ILGA World to share it. I think in general, we're in conversation with the Turkish activists. There's a real conversation to be had on advocacy against such statements, but at the same time, security of activists. We're emphasizing the need for the Turkish government to protect vulnerable citizens exactly in the times of a crisis like that. And we're trying to not play into polarization. So I think that's one advice on anyone who wants to get active on that. And to, for example, really focus on the right to privacy of people and the right to protection that's also in the Turkish constitution. But as I said, we have a statement, and everyone who wants to know a little bit more around advocacy on Turkey could just get in touch with me directly. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Katrin. Then we had a request from Six Rank to share their information on COVID-19 among the Iranian community, which I'm posting into the chat. Are there attendees who would want to make a statement or ask a question? If so, you would have to raise your hand and request speaking, then I'll That does not seem to be the case. Let me see. Then how about we wrap up the session, and then we're only 10 minutes late. Victor, would you like to have another 2 minutes to share final thoughts, and then I'll have another 2 minutes and wrap up the session and call it a morning.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you everyone for the extremely important information around the floor. It's all taken in, and I'm very much hoping that you will see reflected in the work that the mandate does. Just a couple of elements of information. I think that one connecting element in what we have been discussing is the importance to ensure that we begin to build in accountability in what is being done. I know that we have all shared the experience of how this response was put together in a situation where, admittedly, from the highest levels of governments and many governments to organizations, to perhaps each one of us in our individual spheres, we had not included a pandemic in our risk assessment plans. You know, those of us, or you, I wasn't at that level, but those of you who had risk assessment plans probably had things like, you know, I lose a donor, or there is a, you know, maybe somebody had an earthquake or something like that. But I doubt very much that anybody had a pandemic. And so I think that we all went into a mode of reacting, very, very much focused on survival and reaction. But it's becoming time where the situation will become the, I hesitate the word normality, but the everyday reality that we live under for a long time. And I think that it is important that we build understandings of accountability in the actions that are being exercised right now. And I mean accountability both of state structures, but also very much I think it's important to begin to understand accountability at all levels, including within communities, and including, of course, in relation to measures taken by states. That's the exercise that I'm hoping to do. And then a very, very specific issue in relation to intersex persons, which of course Mani mentioned, and I'm very much aware of this issue. The continuance of my work in relation to intersex issues has always been to take point of departure in the background document issued by the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I've very much wanted to continue that work this year. I was hoping to do it in the first semester. That had to be delayed a little bit because of the difficulties. There was meant to be, there was an idea to have a meeting with other special rapporteurs and to actually take the work forward to see how we would do it. And in that, I hope that you know that my lack of automatic inclusion of the I is a lot more of a sign of respect of the specificities in your advocacy targets, and the importance that every time that the intersex issues are articulated, that they should be reflecting specificities of the intersex community. And I would be very keen, again, in this philosophy of just operating now in this sense of retaking that element in my agenda and ensuring that this year there is progress in relation to the work of the mandate in relation to intersex issues. So please, let's have that conversation and let's move it forward. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you, Victor. And I think we're at the end of the webinar. I will not attempt to wrap up, to repeat, of course, what we have heard. There's been a lot of comments and a huge diversity. What I will say though is that I think what sticks is that what we've seen in under the COVID crisis is not new. We've seen this before, it's just gotten worse. COVID aggravates the effects on our communities that have been there for decades, sometimes even centuries, which as well means that we will have to both protect, adapt, and rally, as Katrin has put it. And I will close with a suggestion that came in the Q&A box. An anonymous attendee said they would like to know what the strategy is to maneuver away from seeing COVID-19 as a crisis, but as an opportunity. And of course, each crisis is an opportunity. And when I see what now is possible in order to respond to COVID in our societies, and when I think of what would be possible if something like that was applied to social justice, I think that then we might see the world that we actually want to see. And that's a thought that I'm clinging to in my darkest hours. And maybe that's a thought that we can end this webinar on. And I'll thank all the speakers, all the attendees, and I trust we'll meet as well again in other settings. And I wish you a good day, night, morning, wherever you are. And maybe we'll see each other in the afternoon webinar at 5 o'clock. Goodbye.